quiet residential street somewhere in the Midwest. Salt stains along the curb, bare trees, an older sedan parked in the driveway. Nothing about the scene feels dramatic. A young college student walks up the front steps carrying a small camera bag, a legal pad, photocopied newspaper clippings folded inside a manila folder. One black and white photograph is barely visible near the top. Janet Chandler. The student knocks, a few seconds pass, then the front door opens just enough for an older man to appear in the frame. Gray hair now, slower movement, a face that has spent decades becoming ordinary again. The student introduces himself. We're students from Hope College. We're working on a documentary about Janet Chandler. And for a moment, the man at the door freezes. Not dramatically, not visibly panicked, just a hesitation, a flicker of recognition. The kind of recognition people have when a name that they thought belonged entirely to the past suddenly appears in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. Because for more than 20 years, the story surrounding Janet Chandler's murder had remained frozen inside the same explanation. Robbery, abduction, cold case. But the people who knew the truth were no longer living inside the world they had been protecting when they first lied. And now, for the first time in decades, someone was asking questions again. Welcome back, listeners, to Dark Dialogue, the podcast where we unravel the shadows of the human mind and dive deep into the mysteries that haunt small towns and big cities alike. I'm your host, John.
And I'm your co-host, Angela. And together with John, we shine a light on the stories that keep us up at night. Unsolved disappearances, lives stolen too soon, and the questions that refuse to be buried.
For the last 2 episodes, we've examined how the murder of Janet Chandler became trapped inside a narrative that explained just enough to survive. A roadside motel robbery, a clerk abducted during a late night shift, a crime committed by someone outside the Blue Mill Inn. But underneath that story were contradictions that never fully went away. The front desk scene did not behave naturally. The body recovery scene pointed towards something far more organized and personal. And surrounding all of it was an isolated social environment investigators never fully understood while it still existed. And by the early 1980s, the case was effectively frozen. Not forgotten, but frozen.
The file still existed, the rumors still existed, the people connected to the case still existed.
Exactly, but the framework surrounding the murder had hardened over decades. And that's something that people often misunderstand about cold cases. They don't remain unsolved simply because evidence disappears. Sometimes they remain unsolved because the wrong explanation settles over everything early enough that institutions, communities, and even witnesses begin organizing themselves around it. And over time, that story starts feeling permanent.
Until something changes the pressure surrounding it.
Right. And in Janet Chandler's case, that pressure didn't begin with a dramatic forensic breakthrough. It began with a classroom project. A group of Hope College students working with Professor Bill Schock decided to revisit the murder of former Hope student whose case had remained unsolved for nearly 25 years. And what happened next matters for reasons much larger than this case alone, because this is the reason that investigative journalism exists. It's the reason that documentaries exist. It's the reason that people continue listening to unresolved stories decades after institutions and communities have emotionally moved on. Not because tragedy is entertainment, but because silence thrives inside of isolation, routine, and time. And sometimes the only thing capable of destabilizing a protected narrative is renewed attention from people willing to keep asking questions after everything else has stopped.
Especially people outside the original environment.
Right, because the students approaching this case were not carrying the same assumptions that investigators had in 1979. They weren't connected to the strike. They weren't connected to the guards. They weren't socially entangled in the mythology surrounding the Blue Mill Inn. To them, Janet Chandler wasn't an old robbery file. She was a young woman close to their own age whose murder had never been explained. And once the case becomes socially active again, the silence surrounding it started changing shape. So tonight, we examine what happens when a story frozen for more than 2 decades finally begins to crack under renewed pressure. Because the murder of Janet Chandler wasn't about to be solved by one interview or one documentary or one confession. It was about to unravel slowly as the people who had protected the story for years began losing control of it. So in the early 2000s, Janet Chandler's murder had been cold for nearly 25 years. The Blue Mill Inn environment is long gone by this point. The strike history gone. Witnesses are scattered across the country, and publicly, the case has settled into the same familiar description that it carried for decades: an unsolved robbery homicide from 1979.
A story everybody recognizes, even if nobody fully believes it anymore.
Exactly. By this point, the robbery narrative has become less of an active theory and more of a permanent piece of local memory. It's stable, it's familiar, it's emotionally settled until a classroom conversation changes everything. At Hope College, Professor David Schock is teaching a documentary production course. Now, during that semester, I've heard this told a couple of different ways. I think this is the accurate way. And that is that during the semester, retired Holland Police Captain Bob DeVries visits the class to speak about media and law enforcement. Now, the other story is that Schock interviewed DeVries at his office. I don't think that's right. I'm pretty positive DeVries went to the school and talked to the class. And near the end of the discussion, someone asked him a very simple question. What's the one case that you wish you had solved?
And he answers immediately?
Immediately. Janet Chandler, no hesitation, no long explanation, just the name. And that matters because after 25 years, this case still lives close enough to the surface that a veteran investigator doesn't need any time to search for it. It's already there waiting. And I will say, it's also reported that her picture was still hanging above his desk.
Okay.
25 years later. Yeah. So
she's living rent-free in his head.
He took this seriously.
Yeah.
Now, what begins as a possible class project quickly becomes something heavier because Schock approached the class and was like, what do you guys think about doing a documentary on this? And they were like, we're in. Mm-hmm. So, and he talked to him very bluntly about, we're not going to solve this case. We're not going to change anything, but it's a story we could tell. And they were like, yep, we're in. And Janet wasn't just a homicide victim from Holland. She had also been a Hope student.
Yeah.
So the people researching the case are now walking the same campus that she once walked.
She's alumni. She's family.
Right. Sitting in the same classrooms that she might have sat in, looking at photographs of someone close to their own age whose future stopped abruptly in 1979.
So Janet stops feeling like an old case file at this point and starts feeling personal again.
Right. And that changes the emotional gravity of the investigation immediately because the students aren't emotionally connected to the strike, the guards, the Blue Mill mythology, the robbery framework. They're only connected to Janet. Psychologically, that changes everything about the interviews that follow. Sitting across from detectives, people calculate legal risk. Sitting across from college students with cameras, the calculation changes.
It becomes less about, will I get arrested, and more about, how will I look in this story?
Right. Some witnesses likely underestimate the students entirely. Others may feel safer talking to them than talking to law enforcement. Mm-hmm. And for some, there may even be a kind of emotional disorientation because now young people the same age Janet once was, sitting across from them asking what happened to her. That's a very different kind of pressure than an interrogation room. And as the documentary develops, the case slowly begins moving back into the public view. Interviews are conducted, archives revisited, Janet's photos are circulating again, old rumors begin resurfacing, and eventually the documentary airs publicly through WGVU, and like opening night was like 2 days before the 25th anniversary.
Oh, wow. So with that, suddenly the murder isn't trapped in an old case file anymore.
Right. It becomes socially active again. The case moves from private memory back to public conversation, and that distinction matters enormously because unsolved cases often survive through emotional distance. Communities adapt to them. Institutions compartmentalize them. Witnesses learn how to live around them. But renewed public attention disrupts that equilibrium. And honestly, this is part of why investigative storytelling exists in the first place. It's not because podcasts or documentaries magically solve crimes, because they don't.
We wish they did.
We wish they did, but detectives still have to build a case. They have to corroborate statements. They have to conduct interviews. They have to prove facts in a court of law. Podcasters are not going to be doing that. But
someday.
Not me. Hell
I'm
with
kidding.
that. But storytelling can change the pressure surrounding the buried truth.
It can force people to look at something they'd emotionally learned to live around.
Right. Storytelling does not replace investigation. It changes the environment investigation happens inside. It rehumanizes victims. It destabilizes old narratives. It creates scrutiny. It creates accountability. And sometimes it creates enough discomfort that silence becomes harder to maintain. And that's exactly what begins happening in Holland. The documentary generates attention. The attention generates pressure. Pressure generates institutional response. And soon, law enforcement announces a renewed multi-agency cold case effort that's focused on Janet Chandler's murder. And with that, investigators begin conducting new interviews. And for the first time in decades, people connected to the Blue Mill Inn understand something very important, and that is this case is no longer safely buried in 1979.
And the people who built the original story are now being forced to revisit it.
Right, except now they're older. The Blue Mill environment does not exist.
Does Blue Mill exist?
No, I don't think so. It's
At
long
this
gone.
point?
No.
Okay.
I can't say that unequivocally, but I'm pretty sure it's gone.
Okay.
The loyalties are not stable. The fear has completely changed shape. And perhaps most importantly, the people asking questions are no longer operating inside the original framework that protected the robbery narrative in 1979.
Mm-hmm.
So at first, the changes are pretty subtle, small inconsistencies, old rumors becoming more specific, witnesses remembering details differently. But investigators begin noticing something very important, and that is that certain people connected to the case seem increasingly uncomfortable with the original robbery explanation itself.
So the first cracks aren't confessions.
No, the first cracks are structural. The emergence of an entirely different kind of story underneath the robbery narrative. A story involving parties, relationships, internal dynamics, and the people inside the Blue Mill environment itself. And once that possibility starts surfacing publicly, the robbery story no longer has enough weight to hold the case together by itself. So once the Janet Chandler investigation becomes active again, the pressure shifts quickly from public attention to private conversations. Detectives now begin re-interviewing people that were connected to the Blue Mill Inn. The former Wackenhut guards, the former inn staff, the people who hadn't been questioned seriously in decades. And psychologically, these interviews are happening in a completely different environment than existed in 1979.
The people sitting across from the investigators now aren't the same people they were 25 years earlier.
Right. Like I said a minute ago, that blue mill ecosystem incestuous mess of shit that we've talked about, long gone. The strike is long over.
The need to protect their brotherhood is gone.
Right. The group itself is scattered all across the country. They're not still working for Wackenhut. They have no real affiliation with each other anymore. They're no longer men living inside a tightly controlled social world. They're aging individuals carrying private versions of the same night. And by most accounts, the emotional atmosphere surrounding these re-interviews feels heavy almost immediately. Not dramatic, more like exhaustion, dread, and brittle calm. The kind of emotional state that develops when people have spent decades building adult lives on top of something very major that's been left unresolved.
So it's not panic yet. It's people realizing the story they've lived inside may no longer protect them.
Right. And investigators understand something important this time around. They are no longer interviewing a unified group. They're interviewing isolated people whose memories, loyalties, and self-protective narratives have all drifted differently over time. At first glance, the changes are very subtle. Small contradictions, hesitation in timelines, minimized relationships, witnesses correcting older statements in just very small ways. But investigators begin noticing a new kind of language surfacing over and over again.
Party?
Right. Surprise party. Going away party. Gathering at the motel. Terms that either hadn't appeared in the original investigation or had never been treated as structurally important. And that shift changes the case immediately. Once investigators begin hearing about a planned gathering involving Janet, then the robbery framework starts collapsing under its own weight. A robbery would suggest a stranger, opportunity, definitely a motive to get cash, a spontaneous escalation, but a party would suggest planning, familiarity, social coordination, and some group of insiders.
And it means Janet's movement that night may have started socially, not violently.
Right, which reframes almost everything. The front desk scene, the phone call, the staged robbery indicators, those details stop looking like the beginning of a crime and they start looking like the explanation that was created afterwards. And the cold case investigators approach this very differently than detectives could in 1979. They are not emotionally attached to the robbery theory. To them, robbery is simply the old explanation. It's not the correct explanation. And they also have something that the original investigators never had, and that was decades of statements to compare against one another.
So now they can actually measure how the story changed over time.
Right. 1979 interviews beside 2004 interviews, contradictions beside revisions, omissions beside later admissions. The investigation becomes less about isolated interviews and more about tracking narrative drift across the decades. And one of the most important patterns that investigators begin noticing is something subtle but extremely revealing. People who originally positioned themselves as distant from the crime start placing themselves much closer to Janet socially. Not confessing, but moving inward. Suddenly, someone knows more about the party. Someone else remembers who was there. Maybe another witness acknowledges seeing Janet later in the evening than they previously admitted.
So the people who first described themselves as peripheral are now quietly placing themselves inside the social structure surrounding the crime.
Exactly. And once that starts happening, investigators realize something very critical. The original robbery narrative wasn't simply incomplete. It had been built by people already much closer to the crime than they originally admitted. And underneath all of this, another force is working quietly in the background. Guilt. Not sudden guilt. Erosion. Decades of drinking, rationalization, compartmentalization, repeating softened versions of events until those versions become psychologically necessary.
But under pressure, those stories start becoming harder to maintain.
Right, especially because investigators are no longer asking what happened during a robbery. Now they're asking what happened at the party. That is a completely different investigation. Before we keep going, I want to take a quick second. If you've been listening to Dark Dialogue, you already know that this isn't just storytelling. Every episode is built around one goal, keeping the focus on the victim and working towards the truth. So if that matters to you, make sure that you're following the show on whatever platform you're listening on. And if you haven't yet, take a second to leave a rating or a review. It makes a bigger difference than people realize. And it's what helps these cases reach people who otherwise wouldn't even hear them. All right, so let's get back to the story. This may be the most important thing happening during the re-interview phase. The people connected to Janet Chandler's murder are no longer functioning like some kind of protected elite group. They're functioning like a bunch of isolated individuals scattered all over the country, carrying incompatible versions of the same buried event. And that synchronization is seriously breaking at this point.
And once that shared structure starts weakening, silence becomes unstable.
Right, because the case isn't suddenly exploding open. It's slowly coming apart at the seams. One contradiction, one shifted memory, one uncomfortable interview at a time. And by the time investigators begin hearing multiple versions of the same party story, the robbery narrative is no longer explaining the case at all. It's surviving inside of it. So by the mid-2000s, the Janet Chandler investigation has fundamentally changed shape. And as investigators continue comparing the old statements and the new statements, one name keeps pulling towards the center of the case. And I hope the disdain for this total pile of shit leaks out of my breath as I say his name.
I can feel it already.
Robert Lynch, disgusting asshat of a human being.
And that's the man who made the original robbery call.
Right. And that matters enormously because Lynch isn't just connected to the crime. He's connected to the construction of the original story itself.
Yeah.
Now, by this point, this piece of shit is no longer a young Wackenhut guard that investigators would have encountered in '79. He's older. He's worn down. He was an alcoholic in '79. He's still a bad alcoholic in 2004. Bad enough that it's going to affect the court case. We'll get to that. But he's a very bad alcoholic. He's heavily burdened with the weight of what happened at the Blue Mill Inn. And people who interact with him during this phase describe something important, not confidence, total deterioration.
So he doesn't feel like someone's successfully carrying a secret anymore.
No, he feels exhausted by it. And that's an important distinction because what investigators are seeing in Lynch isn't sudden transformation. It's slow erosion. Decades of drinking, rationalization, compartmentalization, trying to live an ordinary life on top of something that's morally catastrophic. Investigatively, Lynch becomes critically important for another reason too, and that is that he occupies a unique position inside this case. He knows what happened before Janet disappeared, what happened after she left the motel, and what happened when the robbery narrative was created. The original framework itself runs directly through this total piece of shit.
So if Lynch starts weakening, the entire robbery story starts weakening with him.
Right, because once the person who helped architect the explanation becomes unstable, then the explanation itself becomes unstable.
Kind of like cut off the head of the snake.
Right.
Gotcha.
And eventually investigators make a strategic decision. They arranged to sit down with Lynch and show him the Hope College documentary,
Oh,
Who Killed Janet Chandler?
I like it.
Not in some theatrical setting, just a room, a TV screen, investigators nearby, and Robert Lynch watching the story of Janet Chandler unfold publicly for the first time in decades.
Except now he's not watching it as a rumor or memory.
No, he's watching Janet's photographs, and I think the key thing was interviews with her family, especially her dad, the unresolved grief surrounding her death, and a generation of students trying to understand how this happened to her. The documentary forces something investigators understand very well. It forces Janet back into the room as a human being. According to later accounts, the first thing that breaks during this session isn't the story, it's Lynch emotionally. He cries, he talks about regretting his life. He struggles to maintain the emotional distance that he's been able to rely on for decades.
So before the narrative collapses, the self-protection collapses.
Right. I mean, it's said that the investigators talked about him being a father and how he would feel if then showed him the movie and it just broke him. Because for years, Lynch had been surviving psychologically through minimization, saying, well, we were drunk. Things just got out of control. I wasn't the worst one there. But sitting in that room, those internal stories stopped functioning in the same way, especially because investigators now know other witnesses are talking too. And eventually, the hidden structure of the crime begins surfacing directly. Lynch acknowledges there had been a planned, quote unquote, surprise party for Janet. Not a robbery, a gathering organized by people inside that Blue Mill environment itself. Guards, motel staff, people Janet already knew.
So the crime starts before the phone call ever happens.
Right. And that realization changes the case completely because now investigators understand that Janet was not taken by a stranger who walked into the motel looking for money. She was lured socially by insiders operating inside an environment that already trusted them. And once investigators learn about the party, the robbery narrative dies. The phone call, the missing money, the stage front desk scene, all of it changes meaning instantly. Those details no longer look like the origin of a crime. They look like post-crime narrative management.
The robbery story wasn't the event.
No, it was the cover story built afterwards. Lynch also begins naming other people connected to the party and the assault. Multiple guards, multiple participants, and eventually people in supervisory roles around the motel itself, which introduces another devastating realization. This was not a single offender improvising violence alone. This was a group crime sustained by group silence.
And once one person starts talking, everyone else realizes the structure protecting them may already be collapsing.
Right. For decades, silence functioned collectively. But now the Blue Mill environment no longer exists to stabilize the narrative socially. Loyalties have weakened, fear changes shape, and self-preservation starts overtaking group cohesion. And this is the moment the Janet Chandler investigation transforms permanently. Not because investigators suddenly discover some new evidence, but because the architecture surrounding the crime finally begins failing under sustained pressure. The robbery narrative collapses, the hidden social structure emerges, and for the first time in 25 years, investigators begin understanding what the case may actually have been from the very beginning. A planned setup, a prolonged sexual assault, a coordinated cover story created by people inside the Blue Mill Inn itself.
And once that truth starts surfacing, there's no way to put the story back where it was.
No, because after decades of being treated as the victim of a roadside motel robbery, Janet Chandler is finally beginning to reemerge as the victim of something far more personal, far more organized, and far more horrifying than the original story ever allowed. For more than 25 years, that robbery narrative had protected the people inside the Blue Mill Inn from the full weight of what happened there. Now, for the first time, that protection was beginning to fail. So like we've said, for more than 25 years, Janet Chandler's murder survived publicly as a robbery story. A late-night motel crime, a vanished clerk, an unsolved cold case that slowly faded into local memory. But underneath that story, the truth had been waiting the entire time, fragmented across silence and fear and guilt and rumor and total freaking animalistic pieces of shit who spent decades trying to survive what they knew about that night.
And eventually the story stopped holding together.
Right. Not because one piece of evidence suddenly solved the case, but because time changed the people that were protecting the lie. And I think a huge part of that was that ecosystem was long gone. Mm-hmm. Loyalties were weakened, memories had drifted, guilt had accumulated, and once enough pressure returned to the case, the robbery narrative finally began to collapse under the weight of what it had been hiding: a setup, a party, a prolonged assault, and a coordinated effort to explain Janet Chandler's disappearance as something far less personal than it really was.
And after all those years, Janet finally starts emerging from underneath the story built around her.
Right. And maybe that's the real lesson inside cases like this. The truth doesn't always disappear. Sometimes it survives quietly inside contradictions that people stop questioning until someone finally forces the story to move again. This is You're Not Alone by the J.J. Hawk Band. And this is Janet Chandler. There's a particular kind of tragedy that exists in cases where the victim knew the people that was responsible for their death, because violence committed by strangers is terrifying in one way, but violence that emerges from familiarity carries something deeper: betrayal. And at the end of this episode, that betrayal becomes impossible to ignore. Janet Chandler wasn't taken off the side of a highway by someone who appeared out of nowhere. She was drawn into a social environment built around people she already recognized, people she worked around, people she spoke with, people she had reason to believe were safe enough to stand beside casually at the end of a winter shift. And that's one of the hardest realities in this entire case, because when people hear the phrase cold case, they often imagine mystery as distance, but in Janet's case, the truth was never emotionally distant from the people who lived around it. It sat inside marriages, friendships, alcoholism, memory, silence, fear for decades. And meanwhile, Janet remained permanently 22 years old while everyone else kept moving. That contrast is difficult to set with. The people connected to the Blue Mill Inn built entire adult lives after 1979. Some had families, some moved across the country, some tried to reinvent themselves, some spent years trying not to think about what happened at all. But Janet never got the chance to become anything older than the young woman walking into another overnight shift at the Blue Mill Inn. And one of the things this case forces us to confront is how easily communities can normalize unresolved violence over time. Not maliciously always, sometimes gradually, quietly. People adapt, stories settle, contradictions become familiar, and eventually, the emotional urgency surrounding a victim starts fading for everyone except the people who love them the most. That's part of why renewed attention matters, why documentaries matter, why journalism matters, why people continue revisiting unresolved stories years after institutions and communities emotionally move on. Not because tragedy is entertainment, but because memory is fragile and because victims deserve more than becoming background noise inside old case files. Janet Chandler deserved to be remembered as a human being long before this case became publicly solved. She deserved dignity in 1979. She deserved urgency in 1979. And she deserved an investigation capable of understanding the environment surrounding her before that environment disappeared. Instead, for decades, the public version of Janet's story reduced her life to a robbery narrative that concealed the actual human reality underneath it. A young woman isolated socially by people she knew. A woman whose trust was manipulated inside an environment that had slowly normalized dangerous behavior long before that night ever arrived. And maybe one of the most painful things about this case is realizing how many opportunities existed for someone, anyone, to stop what was happening to her, to leave, to intervene, to refuse, to tell the truth sooner. But Janet Chandler was the only person in that environment who never got another chance afterward. Everyone else carried the burden of living with what happened. She carried the consequences of it forever. And before we move into the final episode of this series, before we reconstruct the party, the assault, the staging, and the long shadow left behind afterward, it matters to stop and remember the person underneath all of it. Not the evidence, not the confessions, not the mythology around the Blue Mill Inn. Just Janet, a daughter, a student, a young woman trying to build a future for herself in Western Michigan during the winter of 1979. Someone who should have been allowed to leave work that night, drive home, and continue living the rest of her life. Someone who deserved to grow older.